an independent local bookstore. You know, we all know you can buy books a couple of dollars cheaper on the internet. But when you buy from your local independent bookstore, this is what you get, a whole community of readers. And one of the things that really speaks to me is that when you come to a bookstore like this, and we're very lucky in Miami to have a bookstore right down the street. In fact, one of the reasons we bought our house was we could walk to it, is that you get book recommendations from people who've actually read those books, you know. I mean, algorithms are no match for actual booksellers. And when I'm visiting a bookstore, this is the first time I've been actually in Sarasota, but the moment I'm in a new place and I walk into a bookstore, I feel immediately at home. The strange thing is, the very first time I went to Paris, I also felt right at home. And that was strange because it's different in every way from Calcutta, the tropical Indian city where I grew up, and from Miami, the subtropical American city where I now live. But of course, Paris exercises such a strong hold on all our imaginations, you know, from books we've read, movies we've seen, music we've listened to. Whether we've been there or not, we all have a really clear picture of Paris in our mind. Goodness, this sounds like I'm weeping with emotion at being here, but I am, but it's actually allergies too. So, you know, even though we all know Paris, that didn't quite explain this sense of déjà vu. And my husband said, maybe in another life, because he's married into a culture where talk of past lives is more common than remarks about the weather. So many years after that first trip, I wrote Haunting Paris, and at its core, the novel is a love letter to the city. And it's not a funny Valentine like Woody Allen's charming Midnight in Paris, but it's complex and layered and heartbreaking as love can often be. So Paris is one of those cities that's easy to love, but hard to know. And before our first trip, a lot of friends, both American and French, said, to cross the threshold, c'est difficile. Well, in my case, it seemed more than difficile, it seemed impossible. I am so clearly an étrangère, you know, a stranger, a foreigner, an outsider. So I never set out to write about Paris, okay, and certainly not from this perspective. I'm not French, not Jewish, neither man nor ghost. But as a writer, you don't always choose your stories. And I know there are writers here, so they can probably say this. Sometimes the stories choose you. And so it was with this story. So if you're like me, one of the joys of walking around a new city is to look into lighted windows and imagine the lives going on inside, like scenes from a film. You know, this is true of many cities. But Paris is made for flânerie, for going wherever your feet and your fancy take you, until all of a sudden your attention is transfixed by something, an overheard snatch of conversation, a vivid image perhaps, and what had been an aimless wander all of a sudden becomes an obsession. So one day, as I was walking down a street on Ile Saint-Louis, I heard a drift of music from one of the lighted windows. Now, I couldn't see who was playing, but I had this really vivid impression of a man leaning forward and listening very intently. The man was Julien, who was drawn back to the place he loved, the woman he loved, the city he called home, and the music had summoned him back because he still had unfinished business. So as Bryn said, it's set in 1989 when all Paris is celebrating the bicentennial of that seminal moment in French history, the revolution that brought us the glorious motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, which you can still see chiseled on every public building as you walk down the street. But for Sylvie, mourning the loss of Julien, it is not quite obviously a moment of celebration, but rather of grief. And Julien had died a few months before, but suddenly, by accident, she discovers a letter hidden in his desk. Now, she knew that Julien had a sister, Clara, who had perished in the Holocaust along with her two little girls. What she didn't know was that Julien always believed that one of the children, one of his nieces, had managed to escape. So now Sylvie picks up where Julien had left off, and she takes up the quest, unaware that she's watched over by Julien's ghost. I mean, this may be old hat to you if you've read the book, but I'm just setting the scene. So her quest leads her deep into Julien's past, to the year 1942, when the roundup of the Jews was taking place on the streets of Paris, and France singularly failed to live up to its own glorious promise of liberté, égalité, fraternité. So, this is a love story in which one of the lovers is dead, a mystery in which the detective is a pianist so painfully shy that her nickname is Sylvie la Timide, a historical novel in which the events of the past have a really urgent resonance for today, and a ghost story in which the ghost is the least frightening thing of all. So one thing I always get asked is, do you believe in ghosts? No, of course not. Of course not. But when you are in Paris, you cannot but be in their company, and they're particularly thick in the streets of Ile Saint-Louis. You know, I just want to turn around and ask them, who are you? What draws you back? And then they retreat from me into the shadows and into silence. So the novel was written in and around Notre Dame. Many of the scenes are set there. And actually, the day the cathedral caught fire, Daniel and I were about to get on a plane to Paris. And the taxi was at the door, and a friend texted me saying, turn on your computer and see what's happening. And I turned it on, and I saw this cathedral, you know, lit up like some sort of filigreed luminaria, and I had tears coming down my face, not allergies this time, but real emotion. And I thought, why am I feeling so personally bereft? You know, this is not my city, this is not my country, this is not my history, this is not my religion. But I don't think I was the only one. There were millions of people around the world that felt that way. And what Benjamin Franklin once said still seemed true, you know, that everyone has two countries, their own and France. But behind Notre Dame's soaring towers that reach for the sky, there is a memorial that sinks into the earth. And it's at the deportation memorial that I became aware of the shadows underpinning the City of Light. And that's when my story took a darker turn. If you've been there, you know this, but there's a bronze circle on the floor chiseled with the words, "They went to the end of the earth and they did not return." And then my hair stood straight up as I realized that the French word for ghost is revenant, one who returns. So that became the first line to my book. And I also had the answer to my question, what draws you back? So I'm just going to read very briefly the first page. They call us revenants, those who return. Restless for this world, we pass each other in mute recognition, for to be silent and solitary is our essential condition. But death doesn't end our thirst for a human touch, a human voice calling our name. And so I haunt these familiar caves, this familiar river. Music drifts down from Sylvie's window, and I linger until it comes to an end. The scent of lilacs on the breeze stirs dormant phantoms to life, but music is sorcery more potent. Though bound to time's measure, it exists on a plane beyond time, where there is no past and no future. There is only the present in which the dead revisit this world. Night after night, I wait until the last notes fade away and Sylvie comes to the window at last. I retreat into the shadows as one after another, the beautiful mansions along Quai d'Anjou spring to light, transforming those of us in the gloom below into a throng of ghosts. Occasionally, a passing figure pauses in a pool of lamplight to light a cigarette or glance at a watch. Squandered time, the most enduring of regrets. In the end, a lifetime is not enough. The heart yearns for more. Who can reason with desire? The heart has its reasons that reason cannot know. So when I heard the voice of the ghost, and we writers do hear voices, it was immediately familiar to me because, as Bryn mentioned, I worked as an announcer at classical music radio stations in various cities. So now, during the age of COVID, we're all familiar with how it feels to sit in front of a microphone in a room sealed off from the world. But that's what I did for a living for many, many years. And so I knew this feeling of going out into the city, into homes I would never enter, into lives I would never be part of. So I was in their world, but not of it. And a ghost is obviously in the world, but not of it. And so in a sense, that's what gave me a way to enter this foreign milieu, is that a ghost is the ultimate outsider. So it was in Paris, a city where I was clearly an outsider, that I started to wonder what it would feel like to suddenly become an outsider in your own country. It had happened to my parents in 1947, when the British left India. They partitioned it into two countries. And my parents, who are Punjabis who lived in the northwest part of India, which is Punjab, which had a line drawn through it, now found themselves on the wrong side of the religious divide. So they had to leave their home, India, which was now Pakistan, to cross the border to what was to them a foreign country, but which was now India. And it's one of the ironical situations of history that a struggle for independence that was fought, on Gandhi's principles of nonviolence, resulted in so much bloodshed on either side of the borders as people crossed in the greatest internal migration within countries. So my parents separately moved to India, met, married, and moved to Calcutta. But they never returned to what they always thought of as their home. And many Jews in France also found that the country that they considered their home no longer considered them French. They were stripped of their citizenship and deemed stateless, okay? And I was amazed at the claim that I later read, that people would say, oh, the amazing thing? That only 25% of French Jews perished in the concentration camps, as opposed to 95% of Jews from other countries. But you know what? That's an accounting trick, a sleight of hand. Because if you factor back in those that the Vichy government had stripped of their citizenship, then 95% of French Jews also did not survive. So as I followed Julien's ghostly voice wherever it led me, I found myself at the Memorial de la Shoah, the Holocaust Museum, and I was sitting in the library doing research, and then this elderly gentleman came and sat across the table from me, and he had the saddest eyes I've ever seen. And so one of the librarians, the archivist, came up and asked him if he was there to do research like me. And he said, no, témoignage, testimony. He saw the book I was reading, La Grande Rafle du Veldiv, the Great Roundup of the Jews, and he pointed at it and he said, that I know. So what I was imagining, what I was creating a fiction about, was something that he had lived through. And as he left to go record his testimony, I said, but monsieur, isn't it hard to remember that time, even now, even so many years later? He said, it's very hard, but it's very necessary to tell the story. And it's a sad fact that we all know from our own parents and grandparents that the only questions worth asking we don't think to ask until the only people who can answer them can no longer speak to us. So I realized that's why after so many years people were willing to speak up, like this gentleman, about les années noires, the dark years that were so terrible that many of them never spoke a word about them, even to their own families, even to their own children. And as that generation of survivors is dying out, I think they feel this increased urgency to tell the story, to bear witness, so that when the world said never again, we meant it. And we ignore what they have to say at our own peril. So when we tell these stories, whether they're our own or somebody else's, our responsibility as writers is to do them justice. And you can imagine how daunting it was for me to write about a language that is not my own, about a city that's not my own. And I lived in trepidation for years that when the book came out, people would come up to me and say, but madame, a French woman would never say that. That's not comme il faut. Or, but madame, you have put this building in the wrong arrondissement. You know, if you get something wrong about Paris, there'll always be a Parisian who's very happy to tell you that. If it was important to me to get that right, imagine how much more important to get right the details of a history that was not my own, neither the French part nor the Jewish. And when we're talking about the Holocaust, the responsibility to get it right is not just historical, it's not just literary. You have a moral responsibility to tell the story and do it justice. So what was most gratifying to me was how many survivors or their children would write to me afterwards through my website and say that it really struck a chord for them. So looking back on these atrocities, you know, we always ask, why didn't people speak up? Were they blind? Were they afraid? And when the tide of war finally turned, you know, there were so many résistants de dernière minute, the last minute resistance, who said, oh, you know, the winds of war were changing. They said, oh, I hid a Jewish family in my attic. Oh, I smuggled a Jewish child to safety. But you know what? If everyone who claimed to have done that had actually done that, we would not be looking at this horrifying and incomprehensible number, 6 million. So I have always wondered what it would be like to be one of the just among the nations, the righteous among the nations, which is how they are rewarded in Israel with a tree planted for them, for Gentiles who had great danger to their own lives and with no expectation of reward, helped the Jews during that time. But we always think that, yes, we would have done it, would we? I just wonder the amount of courage it takes to speak up, to be the only voice in the room to speak up when it would have been safer and easier to remain silent. So you all know there's A Passage to India, right, by E.M. Forster. That was set in the time of the British Raj, before Indian independence. And a young English girl, Adela Quested, comes to India, goes on a visit to the Marabar caves, and she ends up accusing Dr. Aziz of rape. So you can imagine the condemnation, swift and severe, and of course the British close ranks against the Indian, and they're having a meeting in the English-only club. Obviously, Indians weren't allowed there. Feelings are running very high. The trial is set for the next day. And then the English schoolmaster, Fielding, gets up and he says, "I believe Dr. Aziz is innocent." Oh, well, the uproar at that he's a traitor, that he is not sticking by the side. And he says, "No, I'm waiting for the verdict of the judge. If he is guilty, I will resign my service and leave India. I resign from the club now." So that always struck me as a young girl, but Fielding was one of the ruling class. He was very secure in his position. He was older. And then I think, what about somebody like Sylvie, the young, poor, very unsure of herself pianist, who is, one of the chief characters in my story, and she's feels like an outsider in this society. So in this book, silence is very complicated. If you were part of the resistance and you were captured by the Gestapo, they had it timed down to the minute how many hours you could last under torture before you revealed the names of others in your cell and gave people time to disband. So under those circumstances, silence was heroic. But under other circumstances, it was cowardice, or even worse, complicity. So courage takes many forms, and for Sylvie, it wasn't that she was unafraid of speaking up. She was very afraid, but she did it anyway. Okay, so questions, fire away, and just one request. There might be some people here who haven't read the book, so no spoilers, please, okay? All right, there is a slight mystery in that. Okay. Bryn?
I wanted to ask, how long did it take you to write this book, knowing how much research you needed to do?
Let me just say that my hair was jet black when I started. It took an extraordinary long time. And this is my first novel to be published, but it's not the first that I wrote. I wrote a novel set in Calcutta. I wrote a novel set in Miami. And they all came very close, and editors loved them, but the marketing department said, "It'll never sell." So I said, "Oh, the heck with this. I'll write about something, what Monty Python always says, and now for something completely different." So I wrote about France, and go figure, that was the one that was picked up by Nan Talese, actually, a legendary editor who has since retired. So I feel like the wait was almost worth it. It wasn't, I write fairly quickly, but I'm not an efficient writer. I wish I were the kind of writer who said, okay, this is the story, it goes from A to Z, And now I will go and do research and fill in the stuff. And there are so many bestsellers who write to outlines, and I go, well, maybe in another life I'll do that. But I get so interested, as you were saying, in the research. And if you're a writer, you know that procrastination is part of the territory. So you are happily lost in the research, thinking it's almost like writing. But then at some point, you have to stop. And here's the interesting thing, Bryn. Although I did a lot of research, I didn't cram it all into the book, because I didn't want it to be just a repository of facts. You can read history or journalism for that. I wanted people to feel their hearts pounding, when they hear the boots coming down the street, turning down your particular neighborhood, coming up the stairs, and for you to feel that same kind of feeling when you hear the knock on the door in the middle of the night. It's always the middle of the night, saying, "Open up, police." So I would say the writing went very quickly, like maybe a year, and then all those trips to Paris, what a hardship. How I suffered. But so the research took 4 or 5 years, and I'm a person who loves the rewriting. So I had to do many drafts of the book, and finally, voila. Nina?
I was struck by the inclusion of the Americans in the book, and especially the scene when the American couple go to the Bastille Day events and the celebration of freedom and liberté, égalité, fraternité, and the rich couple in the building, the French couple, leave town because they do not want to be part of the riffraff.
Correct.
And the American husband said, "Isn't that the point? That it's the riffraff, who took over." So was that just an inclusion of how Americans see the French, or were you writing about class differences in France?
That's such a layered question, Nina, and I have to thank Nina. She's the reason I'm up here at all. About a year ago, she wrote to me through my website, and you all can too. I reply to all emails. And she asked if I would come up here, and, I said yes. And a year passed, and here I am. But the Americans are a very deliberate inclusion, okay, for many reasons. Because we all know the trope of an American in Paris. We know this from Gershwin's music. We know this from the books of Henry James, Edith Wharton. It's always an American who comes to Paris, is transformed by it, and goes back and creates something wonderful. And it seemed to me like the actual people living in Paris, the Parisians, were just background. So I wanted to sort of reverse that, have the Americans come, be in Paris, but then they would leave and the lives of the Parisians would go on, so they were the background. So it was a definite switching. And class is a really important component of the book. Sylvie is the daughter of a maid. And so when Julien leaves Isabelle, his wife, for her, I think she is more appalled, not that he's leaving, but that he's leaving for someone so common, So class is definitely in play here, and the de Cheroises who regard Sylvie as an interloper in the building until the Americans come. And then all of a sudden, whoops, they are the interlopers and Sylvie is one of us, So being exclusive means you always have to have someone to exclude. And that's how it turns out. And it's very interesting because the whole French Revolution and the American Revolution being so tied up together, I think that people forget that how much Lafayette helped, almost bankrupting France, helped America in its War of Independence. So I think all these layered things are in there, but yes, of course, exactly what you're saying, that for a lot of the French, even today, mind you, there is this nostalgia for the old days when there was a king, when the aristocracy was really the aristocracy, and the riffraff or hoi polloi were not equal to everyone else. Thanks, Dana. I know there are a couple of writers here who had some questions. Barbara is writing a book, she told me downstairs, with a ghost, set in Paris. So certainly you have some questions, right?
I was very curious about your childhood influence, about the presence of the otherworldly, or ancestors, if you will. Not ghosts, they're not called ghosts, but it's in your culture to believe that there's an influence very large in your life. Could you talk to that?
Yes, I could. I'm not sure that I'm specifically, in touch with the spiritual realm, but I do believe with all my heart that there is something larger than the little lives we lead. And Julien talks about it, and if he was not an observant Jew at all, but he talks about it, that in Paris, all these people on this one street, on Quai d'Anjou, Chopin played there, Wagner was there, Camille Claudel. If you've been to Quai d'Anjou, you'll see all these markers there. All these people, but how many other nameless, faceless people were part of that history? This is one street on one island in one city. So imagine the vastness of the world in which we live. And I truly believe that when you love someone, the people you love remain a part of your life. And I'm not talking about as ghosts, but their presence in your life is something that nothing can erase, not even death. So, yes.
Okay, so Sylvia's sitting at that table, which she really doesn't belong in, having dinner.
Yes.
She stands up to the Nazi.
Yeah.
Have you ever sat in a room where somebody had, I guess, the strength to stand up, and then it causes his epiphany, okay, that all of a sudden he's in love?
Oh my God, no. When I first came here, again, I have the experience of being an outsider. I was an insider in India, I came here, I'm an outsider. So I was very conscious of the fact that for me to speak up is very different, for example, from Daniel speaking up. And I have to say that at some moments I wish he wouldn't speak up quite as forcefully as he does, but he will not suffer fools or ignorami or intolerance or hatred very well. And yes, it has caused awkward moments when we have had to get up from the table and leave the room because everybody else was so, huffy about the fact that he actually said, no, I think what you're saying is not kind, it is not generous, and you may think because I'm American that I agree with you, but I don't. And I find it easier to speak up like that now because I'm much older and I have, fewer hoots to give. But in India, there's a similar thing because I'm from the majority, I'm Hindu, and people will feel comfortable speaking against Muslims, and I will just say that they are part of India, they are part of our history. How are you saying that they are not, So, again, that answers the question of speaking up. About whether speaking up would cause you to fall in love with someone. This thing about Isabel and Julien leaving her for Sylvie, everybody said, oh, but he gave up his wife, his beautiful house on the Rue de Bièvre, his children, and for this girl who was a nobody. But the thing is, what she made him realize was that his marriage was already hollow. Sylvie was in love with all of them. She loved the family, the husband, the wife, the kids. But, because he left them, she had destroyed that family, and she always felt they would never forgive her. But on the Rue de Bièvre, which is a very short street, Jacques Mitterrand later, he lived there, and he had two families, one that he came home to, and he had a mistress elsewhere and had a daughter with her. So, in France, that was an acceptable way to carry on the two lives. But Julien was a man of great integrity. He did not want to live the double life. And he moved out even before he knew if Sylvie would agree to be with him. So I don't think that she wrecked the marriage. She just made him aware of, as he said, that it was a picture-perfect marriage, but it was a still life. It had every beauty except animation, and he didn't want to go through his life just making the motions anymore. So I think that's what happens. Had he had a strong marriage anyway, he would have admired her courage to speak up. He would have been a little upset at his wife for, humiliating, mortifying their daughter in company, but he would not have left the house, Okay.
I think he was very surprised at Sylvia when she disagreed with the playwright, or I'm not sure that's the character, when she said, no,
Mm-hmm.
this isn't just a small amount,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that no one else in this educated, well-received group that should be there, they laughed at it or just totally ignored in glossing over the problem.
Exactly. And that's it. The people who are in the position of privilege and power should be the first ones to say, listen, this is really not what we all believe. So the playwright comes up with, this egregious comparison of Marshal Pétain, who actually was part of Vichy France, to earlier people who had spoken up. But the fact that Sylvie is the one to stand up, because it's just, she, despite her fear of speaking out, she does. And here's one of the things that people always tell me about the book, and I'm really thrilled, because if I could have been anything, I would have chosen to be a classical pianist. But I don't have a shred of musical talent, so, I worked out the rhythms and cadences and tempi through the words. So people always tell me, oh, it's so musical, it's so lyrical. And then at a bookstore, at a reading like this, someone got up and said that the strongest words in your book have nothing to do with music or lyricism. They're when Sylvie stands up and she says these three words, shame on you. So, that is a big quality I think that we are losing sadly in politics and life, is this ability to feel shame. So, yes?
That brings up a thought I had. I don't recall. Were those words written in French?
No, actually they were in English. I put it down.
So you sprinkled French throughout. What prompted that, or why those phrases and not others? Or
Yeah, you're right. I could have written the whole book just in English with the translated phrases. There's some things that I felt gave a feeling of Paris more, like some expressions that you could say in English but would not be the same. Like for instance, the concierge in the building, she says, this is an honest kitchen, okay? And she means that the food is good, the prices are reasonable. So there are some things that convey it in English and some that don't. And that, Nina, is another reason why I needed the Americans there. If it was just the French, I wouldn't have to explain any of this, So a lot part of it is that the Americans are stand-ins for the reader. You know, as they discover things, we discover things. Do you know what I mean? That why would she need to find out why is that Marché des Enfants Rouges? Who are the red children? Well, the French would know that, but she doesn't. So, but good point.
Thank you for talking about the music, because I that was such a big part of connecting with the other world, and your career as not a DJ, but as a radio, you obviously are very cool to music in some way.
Yes.
But the other question, or not question, but observation that I just thought was brilliant was that as a ghost, Julian seemed to be able to do time travel. And that was just fantastic, that he could speak to like Benjamin Franklin when he was in Paris, and other ghosts that seemed to be there.
Well, thank you. Listen, don't let me stop you at brilliant. You can continue. But, okay, so the two things. For the music, yes, I mean, because I'm from India, everybody always asks me, are you a doctor? And I used to always say, no, I'm a DJ. And although, of course, in classical music, we say announcers, we don't say DJs. So they say, but you're also a doctor, right? No, I'm a DJ. So I got my PhD from the University of Miami, and now I always say, yes, actually I am a doctor. I don't tell them it's a doctor of English literature, because I really believe that books can also help cure what ails the world, okay? So music was very much part of it. Nina knows this. If any of you have explored the website, there is a section under music that has the whole playlist, every bit of music that's mentioned in the book. You'll get little snippets of it there. You'll get the Chopin Barcarolle that lures Julien back to this life. And Jesse Norman, hey, Nina loved Jesse.
The description in the book with Jesse looking like a...
Yes, so in 1989, at this bicentennial, they have Jessie Norman singing the Marseillaise, and she's dressed in this red, white, and blue gown that billows around her, and she was, as you know, a large woman, and so she looks like a frigate in full sail as she circumambulates, and it was just magical, and her voice, So here's the thing, so they got an American woman, an American black woman to sing the Marseillaise for this. And I think that speaks again to the Americans, the French, how despite the family squabbles we have, that we are so interconnected.
And it's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube?
Yes.
Yeah, I probably got it from there. Yeah, okay. So you said something else. Hold it, ghost, different time. Right, so I needed a narrator. Listen, tell me when I should stop, because you guys are so engaged and engaging that, I do have to drive home at some point. But I needed a narrator who knew more about the history than somebody who lived a single life could know. All these intimate details about past lives, about how Pierre Curie died on the streets of Paris. So, I get to set the rules. So my ghost says that his terrain is the past, but he doesn't know the future, because if he knew the future, he would know what Sylvie's going to find out, but he doesn't. He's with her on the quest. So in the past, it's like when he died, he became part of this flowing river into which all other lives feed as tributaries and distributaries, and it's this swirl and eddy of other lives. And at moments of strong emotion, he can enter those other lives, like Delphine or Henri IV, or any of a number of people to give us this window into the past in a way that's more immediate. Okay, brilliant.
Last question, but
Mhm.
make it, it's two questions.
Okay.
So one, how was the book received in France? And two, what are you working on next? I know you're working on another novel.
Okay, the second answer is very, very quick, slowly, you know. And I can't talk about it because the moment I do, it's jinxed and nothing comes out. Not much is coming anyway, but, you know, at some point I had felt that maybe there was more to tell of these stories, but they stopped talking to me. They stopped speaking to me, so
So you didn't even get to stay for the baby?
I didn't get to stay for the baby. I thought maybe, you know, Sylvie will come to Florida, maybe her grandson. But they have retreated into silence, so now I'm listening for the next lot that's interested in me. How was the book received in France? Well, sadly, it hasn't been translated into French. And, you know, in fact, the title is untranslatable in French. I've talked to several people. Haunting Paris has the dual sense of that it's a haunting city and a haunted one. But you can't say that in French. You either have to say Paris hanté or on hantons Paris, so that double sense isn't there. And that doubleness throughout is very important to me, the living and the dead. As I told you, I was very, very nervous about French reading it, but those who did read it in English said, A, that Paris was very present to them. So no, you know, no things about wrong facts. But also they said that they found out things about Paris, about the history that they didn't know. That, for instance, just one small thing, that the Deportation de la Memoria, right, is actually built on the site of Paris's old morgue, which used to be behind Notre Dame, which they didn't know. And that Paris is the only city that has a cemetery just for the decapitated. So this was what I found out in research. Hello?
Wow.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Have your previous books since been published?
oh, no, from your mouth to God's ears, no, they haven't. They haven't yet, but I live in hope, so.
Can I just ask Daniel a question? When Mamta was writing the book, was Julian living in your house with you, and was he very intrusive?
I read about 10 drafts of the book, but I didn't feel like Mamta, I guess, felt present.
He cooked dinner and he booked the tickets to Paris and he read every single draft. And as I was saying, I'm, you know, an obsessive rewriter. I think there's something wrong with me. But like that first page I read you probably went through 30 drafts, you know. And so when Nan said, oh, I love this book, I'm going to take it, Daniel said, thank God I'll never have to read another draft. So he was the happiest about it being published.
Awesome.
Well, thank you all very much. You're